All right, hello and welcome. I'm going to be reading today from a paper by James DeMeo titled Does a Cosmic Ether Exist? Evidence from Dayton Miller and Others. So we're gonna go through this. I came across this man's work. Actually, I think my buddy Chris recommended me this guy when I was looking into or when I was interested in getting into the subject of interferometry, and this guy has excellent resources on his website. Uh, and peace be upon him. He passed away recently, so um, but yeah. Anyway, his website is an excellent resource. While it's up, I highly recommend going there and downloading all the papers that he has organized and publicly available for everyone to get. And all right. So anyway, without further ado, we'll go ahead and start the legal proceedings here. All right. So, does a cosmic ether exist? Evidence from Dayton Miller and others by James DeMeo, 2014. I believe that I have a that I have I believe that I have rarely found the relationship between. Wow, I kept reading that as rarely. I believe that I really found the relationship between gravitation and electricity, assuming that Miller's experiments are based on fundamental air. Otherwise, the whole relativity theory collapses like a house of cards. That's Albert Einstein in a letter to Robert Milken in June 1921. The effect of the ether drift has persisted throughout. In considering all possible sources of air, there always remained a positive effect. Quote from Dayton Miller, 1928. Abstract. The author reviewed the experimental ether drift experiments and publications of Michelson-Morley, Dayton Miller, Michelson-Gale-Pearson, and in more recent others from the late 1800s through present. Many of these historical studies presented positive results in detecting a cosmic ether drift through space. Among these experiments, the most widely cited Michelson-Morley experiment in 1887, which did show a slight positive result and never claimed a null, was found to be the least significant or more robust, or robust in terms of experimental procedures and actual data collected as compared with the far more important 1920 studies by Miller on Mount Wilson near Los Angeles, California. Most ether drift experiments yielding claimed negative results were plagued on various unwarranted assumptions about the capacity of an ether drift to penetrate dense materials such as stone buildings or metal shielding, or that the ether flow would contract matter, including measuring instruments, leaving the ether drift undetectable. Some obtained positive results, but the author chooses to interpret them as negatives due to the unwarranted assumptions demanding an extremely fast ether velocities near the surface of the Earth. Miller was the first to experimentally account for these issues in the most important study made atop of Mount Wilson in the thermal shelter with the largest light beam interferometer ever constructed, where the light beam path was enclosed by glass or cardboard. His procedures accounted for the matter retarded cosmic ether drift with a reduced velocity closer to the Earth's surface. Miller thereby obtained significant positive results over the epoch of study, over 4 epochs of study. Excuse me for a second. All right, let's see. All right. Miller thereby obtained significant positive results over the 4 epochs of his study. Albert Einstein was also aware of these issues and admitted openly that if Miller was correct, then his own relativity theory would quote unquote collapse like a house of cards. In subsequent years, however, the followers of Einstein defeated this evidence for cosmic ether by public ridicule and political tactics not too different from that of the quote unquote modern skeptic movement. Hmm. The Shankland and McCuskey and Leone and Curity article claiming claiming to have reviewed Miller's Mount Wilson data well after the old ether drift experimenters were dead and could no longer defend their findings, were specifically reviewed and found not to support their own stated conclusions, thereby leaving the question of a cosmic ether drift as an open and unresolved question, or one which positive evidence indicates has been proven out. More recent ether drift experiments in the last quarter of the 20th century and the early 21st centuries, notably by Galev and Manera and others using radio frequencies, light beam interferometry, and other novel methods, have provided further proof of the existence of cosmic ether in space. Very cool. Introduction. The history of science records in 1887, or the history of science records the 1887 ether drift of Albert Michelson and Edward Morley as the pivotal turning point where the energetic ether of space was discarded by mainstream physics. Thereafter, the postulates of empty space was embraced, along with the related concepts that demanded the constancy of the speed of light, such as Albert Einstein's relativity theory. The now famous Michelson-Morley experiment is widely cited in nearly every physics books or physics textbook for its claimed null result or negative results. Less known, however, is the far more significant and detailed work of Dayton Miller. Dayton Miller's 1933 papers in Reviews of Modern Physics detail the positive results for more than 20 years of experimental research into the question of ether drift, and remains the most positive body of work on the subject of light beam interferometry. The other positive ether detection experiments have undertaken, or other positive ether detection experiments have undertaken, such as the work of Sagnac in 1923 and Michelson-Gale in 1925, documenting the existence of the speed of light variations, i.e., c plus v or c minus v, but these were not adequately constructed for the detection of the larger cosmological ether drift of the Earth and the solar system moving through the background medium of space. Dayton Miller's work on the ether drift was so constructed, however, and yet yielded consistently positive results. Miller's work, which ran from 1906 through the mid 1930s, most strongly supports the ideas of an ether drift. The Earth moving through a cosmological medium with the calculations made of the actual direction and magnitude of the drift, cited from Miller in 1930 and 1934. By 1933, Miller concluded that one second, scrolling down. Here's a picture of the interferometer setup that he had going on. Figure 1, Dayton Miller's light beam interferometer at 4.3 meters across was the largest, most sensitive type of this apparatus ever constructed, with reflective mirror round trip of a path of 46 meters. It was used as a definitive set, or it was used in the definitive set of ether drift experiments on top of Mount Wilson between 1925 and 1926. Protective insulation is removed in this photograph, and the windows were presented all around the shelter at the level of the interferometer and the light path. Very cool. So let's see. By 1933, Miller had concluded that the Earth was drifting at a speed of 208 kilometers a second towards an apex in the southern celestial hemisphere, towards Derido, the swordfish. Right ascension, 4 hours, 5 minutes, declination of negative 70 degrees, 33 minutes in the middle of the Great Magellanic Cloud and 7 degrees from the southern pole of the ecliptic. Whew. Yeah, he had some specificity on that one. And I think in a later analyzation, it was actually a different, it's not Derido, it's something else. I think it was Draco or Draconis or something like that. Or maybe that's the same thing, but just a different name. I don't know. But yeah, anyway, so let's see here. Uh, this is based upon the measured displacement around 10 kilometers a second at the interferometer, and assuming that the Earth is pushing through a stationary but Earth-entrained ether with a partic- uh, particular direction, which lowered at the velocities of the ether around 200 to 10 kilometers a second at Earth's surface. Today, however, Miller's work is hardly mentioned, as is the case with nearly all of the experiments that produced a positive result for in ether and space. Modern physics today points instead to much of the earlier and less significant work in 1887 of Michelson and Morley as as have as having proved that the ether does not exist. Man, sorry, that was a tongue twister for me. While Miller had a rough time convincing some of his contemporaries about the reality of his ether measurements, he clearly could not be ignored in this regard. As a graduate of physics in Princeton University, president of the American Physics Society and the Acoustic Society of America, chairman of the Division of Physical Sciences and and of the National Research Council, chairman of the Physics Department, Case of School. Wow, that's awesome. Chairman of the Physics Department of Case School of Applied Science, today Case Western Reserve University, and a member of the National Academy of Sciences. Well known for his work in acoustics, Miller was no outsider. While he was alive, he produced a series of papers presenting solid data on the existence of a measurable ether drift, and he successfully defended his findings to not a smaller number of critics, including Einstein. His work employed a light beam interferometer of the same type used by Michelson-Morley, but of a more sensitive construction with a slightly longer light beam path, Figure 1. He periodically took the device atop of Mount Wilson above 6,000 feet in elevation in Los Angeles, California, where the Earth-entrained ether theory predicted that the ether would move faster than light, or would move faster, would move at a faster speed than close to at sea level. While he was alive, Miller's work could not be fundamentally undermined by critics. However, toward the end of his life, he was subject to isolation as his ether measurements were simply ignored by the larger world of physics, which was captivated by Einstein's theory of relativity. Yeah, so they ignored him into out of relevancy. They couldn't refute his work anymore, and they just ignored him out of relevancy. And then they had your boy Skanklin to come in and do their quote unquote analyzation of Miller's work. So after his death in 1941, Miller's work was finally quote unquote put to rest in the publication of a critical 1955 paper in Reviews of Modern Physics by Robert Shankland, uh, S.W. Mikowski, F.C. Lennon or Leon, and G. Curity, hereinafter referred to as Shankland Team or Shankland Paper, which purported to make a fair and comprehensive review of Miller's data, finding substantial flaws. Lloyd Swenson's Ethereal Ether 1972 presents a cursory discussion of Miller and his inexplicable positive results, giving a high degree of significance to Shanklin's team's critique. Swinson wrote, Shanklin, after extensive consultation with Einstein, decided to subject Miller's observations to a thoroughing review. Einstein saw that the final draft of Shanklin's pre-publication manuscript and wrote a personal letter of appreciation for finally having explained the small periodic residuals from Miller's Mount Wilson experiment. Yeah, he got a nice little pat on the back, didn't he? In August of 1954, Einstein replied to Shanklin, I thank you very much for sending me your careful study about Miller's experiments. Those experiments conducted with so much care and merit, of course, a very careful statistical investigation. Wait. Those experiments conducted with so much care, merit, of course, a very careful. Okay, and this is more of and this is more so as the existence of a non-trivial positive effect would affect very deeply the fundamental theory of physics as it is presently accepted. You have shown convincingly that the observed effect is outside the range of accidental deviations and therefore it must therefore have a systematic cause having nothing to do with ether wind, but the differences of temperature and air traversed by the two bundles um, produced by the bands and interference. Nice, dude. Very cool. So yeah, you got a little pat on the back from the yeah. From the above accounts, it certainly would appear that the case was finally closed on Miller, and that their loose ends were finally cleaned up. With the strong support for cosmological ether drift swept aside as the alleged product of temperature errors, Einstein's theory of relativity continued to grow in popularity and dominance. Here I will compare the Shanklin team's 1955 criticism to what is actually contained in Miller's published works, notably in his 1933 paper, which summarizes his work on the subject. It is my contention that Shanklin that the Shanklin paper, published 14 years after Miller's death, attempted to resurrect speculative criticisms which had previously been raised and rebutted when Miller was alive and not given serious credibility among the anti ether fundamentalists. The Shanklin paper also misrepresented Miller's data in several ways and furthermore misrepresented itself as a definitive rebuttal, which it most certainly was not. In order to properly address the major issues with science history, I will recount the central facts of Miller's work. The basic principles of the light beam interferometry for the detection of the ether drift are described in most textbooks, albeit with a typical factual errors, i.e., the slight positive result in the Michelson-Morley experiment as nearly always misinterpreted as a null or zero result. It will not be repeated here. Oops. However, there there were novel methods introduced by Miller into the discussion for the ether drift, along with the interferometer construction, features, and principles of operation that are not widely known. These will be detailed. So, we're going to get into the specifics about what separated Miller's work from Michelson and from the Michelson-Morley experiment and from subsequent experiments after that. So, Miller's work with interferometry. Miller began his work on the question of an ether drift in light beam interferometry with Edward Morley from 1902 to 1906, using an apparatus 3 times as sensitive as the original interferometer used by Michelson and Morley in 1887. Morley and Miller, 1905 and 1907, in 18, or I'm sorry, I don't know where I got that from. In later years, from 1921 to 1928, Miller made additional refinements for sensitivity in his interferometer, increasingly significant positive results. Obtaining increasingly significant positive results. His interferometer was the most massive and sensitive ever constructed, with an iron cross arms of 4.3 meters across, standing at 1.5 meters in height. Four sets of mirrors were mounted at, at each end of the cross arms to reflect the light beams back and forth 16 times horizontally with a total round trip of the path for 46 meters. Starting from the same light source and finally recombined to form the interference fringes whose movement relative to a pointer was read through a magnifying telescope. The apparatus was floated inside a circular tank of liquid mercury, providing a frictionless base for rotation. Fringe shift movements in tenths of a fringe plus or minus the direction were observed by one person who walked around the apparatus while, looking at the cross beams here of the iron cross that he made, or as it turned, speaking out the readings at the bell, at the ring of a bell, which automatically sounded when the electrodes made contact at 24-degree intervals, dividing the circle into 15 parts. An assistant then noted the readings on paper. The readings from consecutive turns from the apparatus were organized into sets, which were made at different times of day and different seasons of the year. Data sets were averaged according to a sidereal time clock. And here we have his fringe shift patterns. Oh, that's cool. I had seen these pictures before, but I didn't know where they came from. So one sec, we'll go back here and look at figure 2. So this is a topographical view of the reflective mirrors and the path that light has to travel. So the light from the Michelson-Morley and Miller interferometers, as seen from above, source S generates light which passes through the lens L and then is split by a half silver mirror D. The beams are reflected back and forth along 1 and 2. The mirrors are numbered 1 to 8 finally before recombining at the half silver mirror D and then reflected into a small telescope eyepiece T where the interference fringes are observed. So the light starts here, hits all this, bounces back and forth, and it's finally recombined here at this half silvered mirror, and then you observe the fringes in here. All right, very cool. So we have figure 3 here. Light interference fringes, as seen in the interferometer telescope, magnified by an eyepiece with precise graduated markings. One could observe the lateral movement or shifting of the fringes as the instrument was rotated. Miller's apparatus used a 50x telescope, allowing the magnified readings down to 1/100th of a fringe, though the readings were typically recorded in the tenths. Wow, so he could make really precise measurements. That is awesome. So let's see here. Data sets were averaged according to a sidereal time clock, which was correlated with the external celestial coordinates. Miller became convinced that the Earth, that the ether and Earth entrainment effect, or became convinced of an ether Earth entrainment effect, which necessitated using the apparatus at higher altitudes to reduce the anticipated entrainment effect at sea level at sea level environments. He additionally undertook the experiments in structures where there were walls at um, at the level of the height that the light was, where there was open air covered with a canvas, only glass or glass and light papers covered were used in the light beam paths, and all wood and all wood or metal shielding was removed, with all wood and metal shielding removed. By contrast, the Michelson-Morley interferometer um, in Figure 4 had a round trip path of 22 meters. Michelson in 1927, and the experiments were undertaken with an opaque wooden cover in the instruments situated at the basement in one of the large stone buildings at the Case School in Cleveland. In his 1933 paper, Miller published the most comprehensive summary of his work at the and the large quantity of data which supported his conclusion. A total of more than 200,000 individual readings were made for more than wow were made for more than 200,000 or for more than 12,000 individual turns of the interferometer undertaken at different months of the year starting in 1902 with Edward Morley at the Case School in Cleveland and ending in 1926 with his Mount Wilson experiments in Figure 5. These data this These data do not include the rigorous control experiments undertaken at the class school or at the Case School Physics Department from 1922 to 1924. More than half of Miller's readings were made at Mount Wilson using the most sophisticated and control procedures with the most telling set of experiments in 1925 to 1926. By contrast, we can mention here that the original Michelson-Morley experiment of 1887 involved only 6 hours of data collection over 4 days. Dude, over 4 days, they redefined all of physics. Nice. Respect. That's awesome. So anyway, um, really puts it into perspective. So the Michelson-Morley experiment, only 6 hours of data collection over 4 days, July 8th, 9th, 10th, and the 12th, with a grand total of 36 turns of the interferometer. So, as shown below, the Michelson-Morley originally obtained a slight positive result, which had been systematically ignored or misrepresented by modern physics, as stated by Michelson-Morley. And here we'll look at these figures real quick. So Figure 3, the light interference fringes, as seen. Oh, I actually read that one already. Figure 4, the original Michelson-Morley interferometer with an approximate 22-meter round-trip light beam path mounted on a concrete platform in the basement of the Case School Physics Building, today West Case Western Reserve University. This interferometer was about 1/3 as sensitive as the 64-meter interferometer constructed later by Miller. A protective wood cover over the light beam path is removed for this photograph. Such dense coverings in stone basements and shielding, as shown by Miller, slowed down the movement of the ether. These problems, along with the relatively short light path and placement at the relatively low altitude of the basement location, virtually guaranteed only a small but never null measured result. And that's true. So they, in modern interferometry, by facilitating the exact mechanisms that Miller said would reduce the readings, they say that they're trending towards zero with modern interferometry experiments. But they're forcing the reduced readings and then claiming that they're actually increasing the accuracy of it and showing that there's no fringe shift pattern because the speed of light is truly the same in all directions. But this, it's not. So let's see here. The most telling experiments to do kicking up 6 hours of data. Yeah, okay. So as stated by Michelson and Morley, the relative velocity of Earth in the ether is probably less than 1/6 of Earth's orbital velocity and is certainly less than 1/4. The experiment will therefore be repeated in intervals of 3 months, and thus all uncertainty will be avoided. So here we have some handwritten data logs. A typical data sheet recording 20 turns of the interferometer In this case, on September 23rd, 2025, 1925, 3:09 a.m. to 3:17 a.m. at Mount Wilson, more than 300 of these data sheets were recorded by Miller at Mount Wilson alone, covering more than 6,000 turns of the interferometer. Yeah, this dude was a G. That's awesome. Unfortunately, in spite of all the claims to the contrary, Michelson-Morley never undertook those additional experiments at the different seasonal configurations to avoid quote unquote or to quote unquote avoid all uncertainty. However, Miller did. Over many years, he developed increasingly sensitive apparatuses, using them at higher altitudes and in open structures, making clear and positive detections of the ether. His experiments yielded systematic periodic effects which pointed to similar identifiable axes of the cosmic ether drift. So this guy, by the way, he mapped out the cosmic microwave background um, axial tilt uh, of the cosmic microwave background that intersects with the sun's ecliptic. Now, in the heliocentric model, they say that it intersects with the Earth's ecliptic, but you know, or I'm sorry, with Earth's axial tilt. But yeah, on a flat Earth, it would be intersecting with the sun's ecliptic. Yeah, it's awesome. He mapped it out to like such an insane degree. It's actually kind of crazy. Um, let's see with the fluctuations relative to the latitude, right? So, and then obviously his interpretation was through heliocentrism, so he was just attributing it to Earth's elliptical orbit and axial tilt. But yeah, he didn't have any of the speeds necessary to get that. But he definitely thought that that's what he was doing. So let's see here. However, Miller did. He systematically periodic effects. Blah blah blah. He argued that basement locations or interferometers shielded with opaque wood or metal housing yielded the most tiny and insignificant effects, while those undertaken at higher altitudes and less dense structures yielded more readily observable effects. The Michelson-Morley experiment, by comparison, was undertaken in the basement of a stone building closer to sea level, so it produced a slight positive fringe, which was in agreement with Miller's results. Miller's observations also consisted through a long period of measurements. He noted that when his data were plotted against sidereal time, they produced, quote from Miller, a striking consistency of their principal characteristics for azimuth and magnitude, as though they were related to a common cause. The observed effect is dependent upon sidereal time and is independent of diurnal and seasonal changes of temperature and other terrestrial causes, and is a cosmical phenomenon. Debates with Einstein. There are several newspapers accounting, or newspapers, man, there are several newspaper accounts indicating a certain tension between Albert Einstein and Dayton Miller since the early 1920s, at least. In June of 1921, Einstein wrote to physicist Robert Milken, I believe that I have really found the relationship between gravitation and electricity, assuming that Miller's experiments are based on a fundamental error. Otherwise, the whole theory of relativity collapses like a house of cards. Privately, in letters and in spoken words, there was a struggle going on for philosophical dominance, and occasionally this struggle surfaced into public view. So goes to disprove the theory. Case school scientist will conduct further studies in ether drift. Einstein discounts experiments. Speaking before scientists at a university of Berlin, Einstein said that the ether drift experiments at Cleveland showed a zero result, while on Mount Wilson they showed a positive result. Therefore, altitude influences the results. The additional temperature differences provided differences have provided a source of error. The trouble with Professor Einstein is that he knows nothing about my work or about my results. Dayton Miller said he has been saying this for 30 years that the interferometers in Cleveland show a negative result. We never said they gave a negative result, and they do not and they do not in fact give negative results. He ought to give me credit for knowing that there are temperature differences that would affect the results. He wrote me in November suggesting this, so I am not so simple as to make no allowances for temperatures or for temperature. Yeah, agreed. You were a smart guy, Miller. You did it. You were just as smart as Einstein, buddy. All right. All right. Sorry, I just had to refocus there. It's kind of drifting off. It's getting late. I'm just kind of like delirious at this point. Let's see. The the above newspaper account is significant as it demonstrates that Einstein was publishing the thermal artifact argument against Miller's results as early as 1926. There are other accounts of Einstein's discontents with Miller's results in conversations with Albert Einstein, written by Robert Shanklin in years after Miller's death. Miller's controlled experiments. Miller was fully aware of the criticisms being made against him and that his interferometer was responding to one or more mechanical or magnetic or thermal influences. Given its large size and sensitivity, it required a careful setup procedure prior to each use, setting the screws with extremely fine threads were used to adjust the mirrors, and the final adjustments could isolate 100 wavelengths of light by just a 16 degree of a turn of a screw. Even this was insufficient for the final adjustment, which was made by adding small weights of around 100 grams to the end of the crossbeams, which sufficient to cause was sufficient to cause a microflexing of the iron supports by only a few wavelengths. Then would the interference fringes come into view. And once in view, additional care had to be taken to prevent distortion from mechanical vibrations. Consequently, from the beginning of the ether drift experiments, Miller took extensive control experiments and procedures to guard against laboratory artifacts and to objectively determine how sensitive his apparatus was to external influences. Especially between 1925 and 1924, Miller's control experiments were most rigorous. He aimed at addressing the criticisms he had received in the following, received following his earlier work, to make the apparatus as sensitive as possible only to the ether drift. A special interferometer of aluminum and brass was constructed to. Oh yeah, we'll take a look at the new interferometer. Very nice, very cool. So, figure 6 here, Miller's controlled experiments. A wooden platform has been supplied for the mirror and the optics of the interferometer K inside the building at the K school. Okay, so a special interferometer of aluminum and brass was constructed to guard against possible effects of electromagnetism. The measured periodic ether drift was the same as with the original iron interferometer. Procedures were made to judge the effects of mechanical vibrations, such as using a loose or tight centering pin. Bases made of wood, metal, or concrete were floated in the mercury tank to judge and correct for the effects of the strain and deformation. The apparatus was not touched when operating, but rather gently pulled in a circle with a thin string slowly accelerated to the desired velocity of rotation While floating in the mercury tank, different light sources were tried, mounted at different locations on the apparatus. Light sources outside of the structure were also tried, including sunlight, but finally, an artificial light source located above the central axis of the instrument was used. Possible temperature effects were evaluated by using radiant parabolic heaters to artificially heat the apparatus in the air through which the light beam passes. These experiments showed that the interferometer clearly was sensitive to artificial heating, and there were steps taken to eliminate the effects. Strong radiant heat sources, it was learned, would badly skew the apparatus if focused upon the only only one arm or a pair of arms of the iron cross. Figure 7. Dang, so the thermal expansion and contraction of the apparatus uh, affected the sense or affected the fringe readings. So let's see. Miller's control experiments: a concrete platform, support beams of the mirrors, the optic. Blah. Yep. All right. So equal heating of the apparatus had no such effect, but metal arms were nevertheless covered in 1-inch cork insulation to guard against radiant thermal effects. The light path was given a glass housing which established the temperature inside, and later a light corrugated paper was covered. Corrugated A light corrugated paper cover was added to the glass cover, which did not affect the ether drift, but further protected against possible temperature variations. Low-level thermal effects were also evaluated as from human body heat, having recording assistants standing at different locations while the apparatus was turned and operated. Temperature effects from the larger environment were evaluated as well. Early ether drift experiments, including those of Michelson and Morley and Morley and Miller, were undertaken inside the basement locations with a relatively stabilized temperatures, but shielded from the ether drift as well, due to the heavy and dense building materials that made up the building that they were in. Miller's ether drift experiments atop of Mount Wilson required a different approach, and a special house was constructed to shelter the interferometer. It had floors, walls, and a roof, and a canvas covered windows all around at the level of the interferometer light beam. During his last set of Mount Wilson experiments between 1925 and 1926, a tent-like covering was erected over the roof and walls to provide additional thermal heating insulation and stuff from sunlight to diminish thermal variations and radiant heating effects from the walls. My man was a G. Let's see. So, figure 8, Miller's fully insulated interferometer, as it was finally employed at Mount Wilson, 1925, fitted with a 1-inch thick insulated cork panels covering the metal support structure and a glass and paper coverings the light beam path, paper removed for the photograph. These steps eliminated any significant influences for ambient temperature differences upon the apparatus and within and air within the beam of light, but still showed a an ether drift movement. So yeah, he took the most extreme care there with his grand finale, and and really isolated those radiant heat temperature effects. Miller noted that at no time during his entire or, yeah. Miller noted that at no time during his entire work on the question did he ever observe any periodic effects expressing themselves according to civil time coordinates as would present itself in thermal effects. Man, let me sorry, I think I gotta redo this. It's gonna bug me. Miller noted that at no time During his entire work on the question, did he ever observe any periodic effects expressing themselves according to civil time coordinates, as would be present if a thermal effect was radiating from a specific wall related to solar heating? Okay, yeah. So when they were talking about how his data was plotted against diurnal and seasonal time and the temperature fluctuations, like that's what they're talking about. Like how just the position of the sun and the radiant heat source, direction of that would affect the readings. So let's see here. Since the measurements were made at different times of day and at different seasons, their amplitude would vary, but the direction of the ether drift would shift only to the same average points along the sidereal azimuth. This is graphically demonstrated in figures 11 or 10, 11, and 12. The measurements were latitude dependent as well. They were analyzed with attention to Earth's rotation, axial tilt, movement around the sun, and the sun's movement through galactic space. Finally, revealed a common sidereal cosmological axis of the ether drift. Literally plotted out. I hope he shows the pictures in this as we continue. Yeah, he probably does on 13 here. But yeah, he literally plotted out the CMB from these measurements. From reading his publication, one gets the impression of Dayton Miller. So here's figure 9. So here's the canvas tent erected around the um, structure he had built. So Miller's interferometer house on Mount Wilson with a canvas covered window all around the buildings, insulating beaver board walls, wood fiber, composites or composite, fitted with a tent cover for the side for further stabilized temperatures. Miller was very careful and an exceptionally patient experimentalist, someone who took every possible precaution to ensure his apparatus was detecting only the phenomenon of interest. He also appeared to be quite content with the possibility, having undertaken all various controls to shield the apparatus from thermal effects in the measurement of the room, he might finally get a true null or zero effect. He did not appear to be a believer in an ether drift who would succumb to this or who would succumb easily to this bias. He was a genuine scientist dedicated to finding the truth of the matter. A null result was not observed, however, and his efforts to control out mechanical and thermal artifacts never eliminated the observed periodic sidereal variations which persisted throughout his experimental work. More will be said about Miller's control procedures below. Michelson and others confirm an ether drift. Miller's work finally did receive an indirect support from Albert Michelson in 1929 with the publication of Repetition of the Michelson-Morley Experiment. The paper reported on the 3 attempts to produce ether drift fringe shifts using light beam interferometry similar to that originally employed by Michelson and Morley. So here's the graphs of sidereal time of his measurements, and here the fringe shift patterns are reaching their minimum and maximum dimensions on the days of the equinoxes. So figure 10, velocities and azimuths of the ether drift from our 4 10-day epochs of measurements at Mount Wilson, 1925 to 1926. The caption is redrafted from the original Miller thing. So here we have another one of it. So here it's plotted against sidereal time. So this is, plotted against the sky. And this is plotted against seasonal effects. And there's no cause and effect relationship. The friend shift patterns don't reach any minimum and maximum dimensions corresponding to the equinoxes or anything relevant in the sky when they're plotted against civil time. So figure 11, porosity of the global ether drift from Dayton Miller's Mount Wilson ether drift experiment 1925 to 1926. The top graph above plots the data from 4 separate months and epochs measured at different times of the year, organized by sidereal time, showing a definite periodic curve. The heavy line is the mean of all 4 epochs. The bottom graph plots the same data against sidereal time coordinates. Here, the plotted data spreads out along the graph without any apparent porosity. This determines that the detected axis of the porosity of the ether drift is the same for different times of the year, but can only be seen when the data is viewed with a cosmological sidereal coordinate system. These data curves are organized along the azimuth means that were later recomputed by Miller. So here we go for what's it called? I'm sorry, I'm spacing out here. Figure 12. His data plotted again. So the average velocity of the average velocity and azimuth of the global ether drift from Dayton Miller's Mount Wilson ether drift experiment. Top graph, average variation of observed magnitude of the ether drift from all 4 epoch measurements. Maximum velocity occurs at 5-hour sidereal time, and a minimum velocity occurs at 17-hour sidereal. While Miller's 1933 paper assumed that Earth was pushing through the ether, moving toward Dorado, near the southern pole of the plane of the ecliptic, the movement and direction of the ether past the interferometer was exactly opposite to this, toward Draco, near the pole of the plane of the ecliptic. It is important from the standpoint of his working theory to clarify the concepts of the net motion of Earth versus the direction of the ether drift. However, if the ether itself is in motion, acting against a cosmic prime mover, the direction of the ether drift and net motion of Earth would be identical, though at different velocities. Bottom graph. Average variation of observed azimuth readings according to sidereal time. This graph uses the same average data curve from Figure 11, published by Miller in 1928, but at the time was given a different baseline average. The same graph is presented here for the first time using Miller's revised seasonal averages published in 1933, which helped define the axis of the ether drift. Amazingly, the independent averages of the 4 epochs provided by Miller, February equals minus 10 degrees west of north, April equals plus 40 degrees east, August equals plus 10 degrees east, September equals plus 55 degrees east. Together yielded a mean displacement of 23.75 degrees east of north. This is close to Earth's axial tilt and can hardly be a coincidental. More discussion in DeMeo's 2002 or whatever. So, okay, cool. They show it. So, this is from Miller's paper here. This is what he thinks he plotted, right? So, if you've ever wondered, like, oh, wouldn't they be able to measure the, when the sun's perihelion and aphelion, and the speed fluctuations of the elliptical orbit that it would have to make. So that's what Miller measured, but to a way smaller degree. Now, obviously, their scale of interpretation for the effects are leaning towards the galactic scale and whatnot for these crazy speeds, but they in fact only really match a 15 degree per hour rotation. So whatever fits within the confines of that with the movement of the sun on a globe that spins 1,000 miles per hour at the equator. So they've never really measured anything that corresponds to 5 kilometers a second, 10 kilometers a second, et cetera, et cetera. That's just the scale by which they choose to interpret their fringe shifts. They've only ever measured, an angular rotation of 15 degrees per hour, really. In and as far as I can tell, they've only really measured that in the northern hemisphere. So with that being said, um, um, for them to say like these speeds and make these assertions that they back up this model of Earth's motion around it, like that's just their way of interpreting it. But yeah, he accurately mapped this out to such an insane degree that um, this is so the cosmic microwave background is axially aligned with this, right? So the motion of the sky, right, that background radiation that may or may not exist or whatever, right, is is axially aligned with the Earth. So on a flat Earth, the sun's ecliptic, so how the sun is tilted to do its orbit around a flat Earth, so that in the northern hemisphere, um, it travels slower, and then it has to travel faster as it goes to the south because it has to maintain 15 degrees per hour. So that fluctuation in the translational speed is what Miller measured. So let's see here. I mean, they hit us with a long gap and stuff. So I'm just going to continue reading from here. So Michelson-Morley experiments. In the first experiment undertaken in June 1926, the interferometer was the same dimensions of the original Michelson-Morley apparatus with a round trip of the light beam of around 22 meters. A fringe shift displacement of 0.017 was predicted, but the conclusion stated no displacement of this was observed. The second experiment, undertaken on unspecified autumn dates in 1927, employed a slightly longer round trip of the 32 meters, given that 57 arc seconds, or I'm sorry, 57 minutes for the assumed one way distance. Given as a, I don't know, given as 53 feet maybe. Again, no displacement for the order anticipated was obtained, and the short report did not give the details about the experimental surroundings or locations. The third experiment was undertaken on an unspecified date, probably 1928, in a well sheltered basement in the laboratory of the Mount Wilson Laboratory, the basement room. The round trip of light was further increased to approximately 52 meters and was given, an 85 and was given 85 feet for the assumed one-way distance. This time, having moved the apparatus to a higher altitude and using a longer light path, a small quantity of ether drift was detected, with which approximated the observed result by Miller, although the results were unjustifiably reported as negative terms. Precautions were taken to eliminate the effects of the temperature, and flexor disturbances were effective. The results gave no displacement as one uh, as 1/15 of that could be. All right, let's see here. These results are the difference between the displacements of the observed at the maximum and minimum of sidereal times, the direction corresponding to the calculations of the supposed velocity of the solar system. A supplementary series of observations made in half directions, half between, gave similar results. Michelson-Gale-Pearson, 1929. 1/5 of 300 kilometers a second is 20 kilometers a second. A result the authors dismissed as they apparently had discarded the concept of an earth entering ether, which would move more slowly at closer to sea levels. As a result of 24 kilometers a second was achieved by the team of Kennedy and Thorndike in 1923. However, they also dismissed the concept of an entrained ether, and consequently to their own measured result. In view of the relative velocities amounting in thousands of kilometers a second to exist among the nebulae, this can scarcely be regarded as other than a clear null result. Hmm. This incredible statement serves to illustrate how deeply ingrained was the concept of a static ether. Michelson, Pease, and Pearson. I don't know who this Pease guy is. I know Michelson-Gale-Pearson, but unless his name was like Pease or something, then I don't know. Anyway, Michelson, Pease, and Pearson went on to make the speed of light measurement on a 1 mile long, partially evacuated steel tube lying flat in the ground, orientated roughly southwest to northeast. While the purpose of this experiment was to not measure any ether drift or variation in the speed of light, such variations were in fact observed and reported in their paper. The newspaper account of these experiments, published after Michelson's death in 1931 but prior to their final publication. Dr. Pease and Mr. Pearson say that the entire series of measurements made mostly between 7 and 9 p.m. show fluctuations which suggest a variation of about 20 kilometers a second. Miller commented on these results, suggesting that they would have measured a stronger ether drift variation if they had taken the interferometer outside of the basement and the steel pipes. If the question of an entrained ether involved in the investigation, it would seem to them such as a massive and opaque shielding is not justified for the experiment, and designed to detect a very minute effect of the velocity of light to. Let's see. Then this is the apparatus used by Michelson, Pease, and Pearson, and their successful detection of the ether drift used to unspecified quantity under 20 kilometers a second. Their positive result was inappropriately dismissed as a negative result because this experiment had prematurely discarded the conceptual implications of an earth entrained ether. This experiment used the largest light beam interferometer ever constructed by Michelson, with a 52-meter round trip light path coming to a close coming close to the sensitivity found with Miller's 64-foot interferometer. It is shown here, situated in the basement location of the ground, which itself was predictably reduced the measured results. Be impressed upon the light throughout the ether itself, and it would seem that it would be essential that there should be at least one obstruction between the free ether and the path of light of the interferometer. Miller had by this time acquired a lot of experience on Mount Wilson using the large interferometer and specially constructed interferometer house. With a light path of 64 meters, Miller's apparatus was significantly more sensitive than the best apparatus of Michelson-Gale and Pearson, given that the Pease and Pearson did make some small detections of an ether drift on their efforts at Mount Wilson. In spite of the fact that it was located at the basement location, their report of a detectable sidereal fringe displacement supports Miller's findings. It is also notable that this is the second time that Michelson's work had significantly detected an ether, though this the first instance that Michelson-Gale, the apparatus, could only measure the speed of light variations along the axis of rotation of the Earth. The papers by Michelson and also by Kennedy and Thorndike have conveniently been forgotten by modern physics, or misinterpreted as totally being negative results, even though they were undertaken with far more precision and more tangible positive results than the celebrated Michelson-Morley experiment in 1887. Michelson went on to his grave convinced that the speed of light was was in was inconstant with different directions, and also conceived of the existence of an ether. The modern versions of science have rarely discussed these facts. Okay. So Miller's team, or I'm sorry, Shanklin's team 1955 critique of Miller. As previously pointed out by Swinson, Shanklin's 1955 critique of Miller's work was undertaken with the most extensive consultation with Einstein, who, like Newton and others before him, had assumed only a tactic or only a static or stagnant ether through which the Earth passes through material or passes through without material effect and hence without entrainment close to the Earth's surface. Shanklin, in fact, was Miller's student for many years and only emerged to become a professional advocate of Einstein's relativity theory after Miller's death in 1941. Shanklin became the chairman of the physics department at Case following Miller's retirement. Wow. And retirement and death, building his professional career upon publications misrepresenting the Michelson-Morley experiment as wow, as the most solid evidence on the question, and publishing widely read reviews with Einstein. Shanklin later took up administrative positions within government agencies developing nuclear energy. He rarely discussed Miller's positive ether drift measurements in any of these papers except in the 1955 paper under the discussion here. In the sense, it is legitimate to view Shanklin and the other members of his team as biased reviewers of Miller's work, uh, and all Einstein advocates from Case University. From the very first sentence in Shanklin's team in the 1955 paper began with a falsehood, now widely parroted in nearly every physics book that is, um, wow, that is, so that's where it came from right there. The Michelson-Morley experiment had a null result. Null result, Michelson. Michelson got a null. Oh, man. Just imagine like all the other physics scientists and stuff are like teasing them. Let's see. All the trials of this experiment, except those carried out by Wilson, or carried out at Mount Wilson by Dayton Miller, yielded a null result with the accuracy of the observation. This kind of chronic misrepresentation of the slight positive results of many interferometry experiments, including Michelson-Morley, Michelson or Morley-Miller, Sagnac, Michelson-Gale, Michelson-Pearson. Man, that's so crazy. Who is this guy? Michelson-Gale-Pearson, Michelson-Pearson. Who knows? It's really bugging me. Suggest an extreme bias and deliberate misrepresentation. The fact that this is an unpopular bias, or the fact that this is a popular bias, does not excuse it. By redefining all the positive results observed by what many, in fact, have been the majority of the ether drift researchers as mere expressions of quote unquote observational inaccuracy, Shanklin narrowed his task considerably. These and other sentences in Shanklin's paper reveal the bias from the get go and give it the spirit of an autopsy where Miller was dissected without careful concern, or certainly where no advocate of the ether theory appeared to be involved in the process. It is possible that by the 1950s there was nobody left that could fill Miller's shoes and make an adequate defense. Ether theory was then being compared to the search of perpetual motion machines. Wow. Dang. Crazy. Swinson in 1972 such ridicule surely must have been silencing the effect of the entire field of physics and astronomy. Swinson also suggested that during the later years, Miller was largely ignored and isolated. This appears to be correct, as according to an interview with Shanklin made in 1981, shortly after Miller died, And he gave all of his interferometry data sheets, hundreds of pages of measurements to his one time student Shanklin with a somewhat bitter statement that he would either analyze the data or burn it. In that statement, wow, in that same interview, Shanklin also blamed Miller for having blocked the, oh, wow, having, whoa. In the same interview, Shanklin also blamed Miller for having blocked the awarding of a Nobel Prize to Einstein for his theory of relativity. Clearly, Miller's work was a major obstacle to the to Einstein's theory of relativity, and for the reason that and for that reason may have given Einstein and his followers the sleepless nights. That's so crazy because the whole thing with the Nobel Prize is the guy that didn't or the guy that like was in charge of the Nobel Prize awards or whatever didn't want to give it to someone who hadn't discovered anything or done any experiments. I forget what it was, but it wasn't a significant contribution. It was just like abstract math or something, and it wasn't. Then they ended up giving him the Nobel Prize for the photoelectric effect, and that was just like a gimme that they gave him for free. Like there's like a whole thing about it, about why, and it didn't really have anything to do with Miller, from my understanding. Like there's an entire separate narrative, uh, independent of whatever Miller may or may not have done to block Einstein from getting a Nobel Prize. Shanklin's team evaluation for random statistical variations. The Shanklin paper did present a statistical analysis of a portion of Miller's published 1925 to 1926 data, concluding that his observations, quote, cannot be attributed entirely to random effects, but that systematic effects are present and to an appreciable degree, and that the effects, quote unquote, observed by Miller cannot be accounted for entirely by random statistical fluctuations in the basic data. Also, the team Shanklin admitted that they did not embark to a statistically sound recomputation of the cosmological solution, but rather looked for local disturbances such as may be caused by mechanical effects or by non-uniform temperature distributions in the observational hut. So they admit flat out that they didn't do any analysis of what Miller was looking at on the sidereal time. It's crazy. In short, they admitted the harmatic patterns in Miller's work or data could not be due to any uh, systematic measurement error, nor result due to mechanical flaws in the interferometer apparatus itself, while simultaneously admitting a disinterest in the computation of any potentially validating ether drift axis, quote unquote, cosmic solutions from this data. These were important admissions as the suggestion is that the useless is that unless they could find some other fatal flaw in the data, Miller had really got it right and had measured a real ether entrained ether drift. Of interest from the perspective of politics of science is the fact that his statistical analysis of the ether was not undertaken by the four members of the Shanklin team listed for the authors of the paper. The analysis was in fact undertaken by case physics student, let's see, Robert L. Stearns in his master thesis. Stearns was given only a footnote credit. Oh, what? What the heck? Oh, yeah. So the analysis was undertaken by a case physics student, Robert L. Stearns, for his master's thesis. Stern was only given a footnote credit in Shanklin's paper. Yeah, so everybody got promoted. Stern, who performed the analysis, informs us about the large amount of data Miller gathered. He mentions the existence of 360 316 sets of data by Miller in 1925 and 1926 for the centrally important Mount Wilson data experiments. Each data set was comprised of 20 turns of the interferometer, with 16 data points per turn, a total of 320 data points per data sheet. Miller noted his work at Mount Wilson data was undertaken, or Mount Miller noted his work at Mount Wilson was undertaken at four different seasonal epochs, each which encompasses a period of around 10 days centered around the following dates: August 1st to August 2nd. April 1st, April 2nd, and September 15th, and February 15th. Whoops, that's not the right word. February 8th. It must be kept in mind that these Mount Wilson data, it must be kept in mind that these Mount Wilson data, that this Mount Wilson data from 1925 to 1926 provided the most conclusive and foundational observations for Miller's ether drift calculations and conclusions as present most clearly in his 1923 paper. As detailed below, the Shanklin team mentions these Mount Wilson data, but the manner which confesses the man. Sorry, I'm. As detailed below, the Shanklin team mentions these the Mount Wilson data, but in a manner which confuses them with his earlier and less significant efforts, including various control experiments conducted at the Case School. The significance of this confusion of dates will be highlighted momentarily. Shanklin's assertion of temperature artifacts. Regarding the possible temperature artifacts of Miller's data, this objection was raised early in the history of the ether drift interferometry, and specifically rebutted by Miller when he was alive. A letter exchanged between Miller and George Jewes from 1934, from a 1934 issue of Physical Review, records part of this debate and appears to be one of the few published criticisms on the temperature issue of Miller. Published criticisms on the temperature issue Miller ever received while he was still alive. Miller had this to say about the problem. Miller had this to say about the problem. When Morley and Miller designed their interferometer in 1904, they were fully cognizant of this, and it has never since been neglected. Elaborate tests have been made to under natural conditions, and especially with artificial heating, for the development of methods which can be free from this thermal effect. That's from Jewes and Miller in 1934. The Shanklin critique never made any systematic evaluation of possible thermal effects using the larger set of Miller's data, was done with the statistical evaluation. Instead, they appear to have gone fishing with Miller's data for something by which they could simply dismiss him on. For example, Miller's own 1933 temperature-controlled experiments were brought into the discussion, where radiant heat parabolic heaters were used to artificially create a general doubling of the size of the interference fringes. Miller describes these experiments. Several electric heaters were used of a type of heating coil near the focus of the concave reflector. Inequalities in the temperature of the room caused a slow but steady drifting of the fringe to one side, but caused no periodic displacement. Even when two heaters placed at a distance of 3 feet from the interferometer as it is rotated were adjusted to throw the heat directly on the uncovered steel frame, and this was no periodic effect was measured. When the heaters were directed to the air, in the light path, which had covered glass, and a periodic effect could be obtained only when the glass was partly covered with opaque material in a very non-symmetrical manner. as when one arm as when one arm of the interferometer was completely protected by a covering of the corrugate paperboard while the other arm was unprotected. These experiments proved under these conditions of actual observations the periodic displacements could not possibly produce the temperature effects. Great quote from my boy Miller. All right. Perhaps without intending to do so, after examining Miller's laboratory notes from Cleveland temperature control for experiments, Shanklin's team confirmed at one point in the experiments where the air and the optical path were directly exposed to heat, large second harmonics, 0.35 fringes for one heater and about twice the value for two heaters, were always observed in the fringe displacements, and this was the expected phase. Shifting the heaters to a different azimuth produced a corresponding change in the phase to the second harmonic. When the optical paths of the mirrors supported were thermally insulated, the second harmonics were greatly reduced to about 0.07 of a fringe. This statement confirmed the wisdom of Miller's approach. They added insulation to reduce the thermal effects of the nearby radiant heater. Only 20% of the uninsulated readings. I have ordinarily commercially available electric radiant. I have ordinary commercially available electric radiant parabolic heaters at my home, and it gets so hot you cannot stand closer than 12 inches without burning yourself or possibly catching your clothes on fire. If Miller had used a parabolic heater even half as strong as this, it certainly would have been a source much stronger than anything present at Mount Wilson. Experiments, particularly at night during foggy and overcast conditions when the entire interferometer house was covered with a tent and the apparatus and the light beams were covered with cork and glass and paper insulation, consider a radiant heater at several hundred degrees Celsius, creating a steep thermal gradient, but only a 0.07 fringe in the insulated interferometer. How much less of an effect would be produced by a human body or even inside of a solar heated wall? Assuming the environmental thermal effects only 1/10 that seen by the parabolic heater, a wood composite radiating heat wall structure at perhaps 50 degrees Celsius, fringe shifts of only 0.007 would have been produced, well below the observational detection. Miller's data sheets, for example, recorded observations in units of. Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah, so it's in the hundreds. So yeah, units in the tenths of a fringe width throughout the readings down to the hundredths of a fringe were possible. Though readings down to the hundredth of a fringe were possible with care. Overall, the accuracy of the ether drift experiments approached a hundredth of the fringe after mathematical averages and many readings were extracted. The Shanklin paper, nevertheless, used these controlled experiments as a weapon against Miller, claiming without evidence that the heater type effects might have occurred on Mount Wilson experiments, even though there are no such heaters or no remotely areas where such a heat source was present. But why would Team Shanklin shy away from undertaking a more systematic evaluation for the temperature artifacts? They could have, for example, evaluated only Miller's daytime interferometry experiments and looked for thermal effects in the southern wall of the structure during the various epochs if they could have shown an effect at the present daytime, which was not present at night. It would have devastated Miller's claim and proved their case. However, this obvious analytical procedure was not performed, or if it was done, it was not reported. The Shanklin paper also resurrected the temperature criticisms by Jews and Miller, but without reference to Miller's rebuttal in the Same published exchange. If the periodic shift, wow, they cut out his quote, dude. How disgusting. If the periodic effects of Miller were observed as a product of temperature variation as claimed by Shanklin and Jews, then why would the variation systematically point to the same set of azimuth coordinates along with the celestial sidereal clock, but not any single terrestrial coordinate linked to civil time? Miller repeatedly asked this question of his critics, who had no answer for it. Great question. Why then would the variations systematically, yeah, crazy. It's clear that Miller had been deeply engaged in the problem of temperature effects and worked hard to know exactly how they might be produced and how to eliminate them. The Shanklin paper, however, seized upon Miller's open acknowledgement of the fringe shift from air heating by powerful radiant heaters during controlled experiments and during other sentences written in his paper or in his lab book, and tried to claim the thermal anomalies were produced by a source of whatever periodic effects were subsequently measured by Dayton at Mount Wilson, when no radiant effect, when no radiant heaters were used, and and when the empirically developed control procedures were placed without some kind of independent experimental evidence to support such a claim of thermal influence and dismissal was illogical. The Shanklin paper also went through a series of arguments about the interferometer house, how the wall materials, roof angles, and interferometry or glass housing, etc., might result in a definable effect on the air temperature with the light beam path, concluding that they could not rule out such an influence, that it, quote, is not a quantitative contradiction with the physical condition of the experiment, given, end quote, given their ignoring the sidereal nature of the porosities. This statement could hardly be taken seriously, and certainly did not constitute a rebuttal of Miller's data. The Shanklin paper finally attempted to correlate several selected daytime interferometer runs with a temperature measurement made at the same time. They acknowledged the difficulty in correlating the low fringe values with low temperature differentials, but found one set of high fringes values that correlated with a slightly higher temperature, even while nothing other, or while noting other sets where high values were correlated with lower temperatures. Finally, they complain, quote, no temperature data no temperature data are available to reveal the thermal conditions at at the roof, which may be responsible for the large fringe shift displacements at the time of the highest altitudes of the sun. If this is sounding confusing, a reading of the normal text provided little clarification. Failing to show anything damning from daytime datasets, the temperature gradients inside the interferometer house might be expected to be at a maximum. They turned their focus to the nighttime datasets. Once again, only a few of Miller's data sheets were selected to prove their case. Data from two nights, uh, August 30th, 1927, and September and September 25th, 1925, with a with stable air temperatures were reviewed. These nights showed very clear a systematic fringe variation, but because the azimuth of the fringes changed minimally over the approximate 5 hours of observations, the critics complained it would be extremely unlikely that the fringes were due to any cosmic effects. Nice, dude. Just threw that in there, huh? Apparently, the Shanklin team was so locked into the older static ether assumptions of the original Michelson-Morley experiment that they were unclear that they should have seen that they were unclear what they should have seen in Miller's data. In 1927, at a conference on the Michelson-Morley experiment held at Mount Wilson's Observatory, where Michelson, Lorentz, and Miller and some others made a presentation and engaged in open debate, Miller addressed these questions. Observations were made for reifying the oh man. Observations were made for verifying the static ether predictions, but it did not point successively to all points of the compass. That is, it did not point in 90 degrees apart of 6 hour intervals. Instead of this, the directions merely oscillated back and forth through an angle of about 60 degrees. The reason for this is that Miller detected the axis of rotation, or I'm sorry, the axis of ether drift as it's orientated reasonably close within 60 degrees to both the Earth's axis of rotation and the Earth's axis of the plane of the ecliptic. Let's see here. The reason for this is that Miller. Oh yeah. Let's see. An important, another important fact, which nearly escapes detection in the Shanklin paper, is that the August 30 data were made in Cleveland, while the September data was made at Mount Wilson. Neither were part of the uh, published Mount Wilson data used for the calculations of the ether drift. Both dates were well outside the 10-day epoch wow periods identified by Miller. Furthermore, not all the interferometer data sheets for a given date, which presumably would have a similar weather and temperature conditions, were included by the Shanklin team for a critical review. They selected only those data sheets that appeared to support their argument of claimed thermal anomaly from their, or for example, they selected tens of sets of observations inclusive, number 31 to 30 to 40, inclusive, made a hut on the Case campus between midnight and 5 a.m. on August 30th, 1927, and, quote, run 75 to 83 inclusive taken from 1820 or from 12:18 a.m. to 6 a.m. on September 23rd. Other than making the claim that the selected data gave them the impression of being the result of temperature errors, they had stated no other criterion for bringing them into the discussion. This biased data selection, or rather data exclusion procedures, force one to ask, what about the data's number 1 to 30? And what about runs 1 to 74? Similar unexplained data selections and data exclusion occurred throughout the Shanklin paper, leaving one to wonder if if the unselected and excluded data, which constitutes the overwhelming majority of it, simply could not provide or support their criticisms. One could imagine the howl of protest which would have occurred if Miller had taken this approach, arbitrarily excluding data from his calculations, which superficially suggests something other than a real ether drift. A third data set from 30 July 1925 was highlighted by the Shanklin team as it contained one extremely large peak where Miller noted sun shines on the interferometer. This data does appear to have part in Miller's published Mount Wilson analysis. However, the Shanklin team extracted only observations 1 and 28 inclusions between 1:43 a.m. and 6:04 a.m. on July 30th, 1925. Obviously, at around 6 a.m., the sun rose and caught Miller him and his assistants off guard. What about observations 1 through 27? Or what about observations 1 through 27 or the other early morning data where the sun didn't shine on the interferometer? These data were not brought into the discussion except they did note that the runs prior to the sunshine indicated or incident demonstrated an extremely erratic behavior that have no ready or we have no ready explanation for this apparent departure. Here, the Shanklin team basically confesses their grab bag of ready explanations was empty, and that they and that the idea that those datas were expressing a real ether drift was simply too impossible for them to consider. The fact that Miller included the note about the sun night on his data sheet speaks to his honesty. Yeah, absolutely. The Shanklin team also identifies the data sets numbers 56 through 58 from 8 July 1924, which was part of Miller's control experiments made in the basement location of Case Physics Laboratory. The temperatures were very stable, and the fringe oscillations were quite small. They argue that these data were proof that the thermal effects on the that there were thermal effects on the apparatus. However, this was the very problem of the basement, dense and having dense surroundings and materials, that led Miller on the path to use an apparatus at the location not subject to significant ether shielding or ether or earth entrainment. After 1921, Miller only used the Case School Laboratory to undertake control experiments, and that is why those particular data sets were not published. The Shanklin paper concluded this contemporary criticism by discussing a few additional data sets, numbers 113 to 111 from April 2nd, November 18, or I'm sorry, no, numbers 88 through 93 from August 5th, 1925, numbers 84 to 94 or 84 to 91 and February 11th, 1926. Here, the amplitudes and the phases were claimed to have been nearly alike, but insufficient detail was given to allow for a review of the critics' claims, and they did not appear that they were once again incorrectly misinterpreting Miller's data along the lines of the static ether assumption. As in almost all the cases above, giving none of the data were analyzed systematically, nor were they presented in such a manner that the author's criticisms could be factually reviewed. I got the impression that they simply scanned through a pile of Miller's data sheets and with a wave of the hand picking the most poignant or picking and pointing to only selected parts and dismissed all of the product of the thermal artifacts or dismissed it as all product of thermal artifacts. Miller detailed the Miller's detailed controlled experiments were basically ignored, as was the fact for all of the as for all of these experiments, and the interferometer was enclosed in a small house covered with a tent, while the apparatus was shielded with a cork insulation, and the light beam was covered in glass with paper panels, paper panels and panel paper. The full row the or With the full rotation occurring at least 1 minute, one is left to wonder how many observable thermal variations could develop within Miller's data, especially variations with sidereal cosmic components. For the casual reader who has not undertaken a careful review of Miller's original experiment and the Shanklin paper, might appear to make a reasoned argument. However, the Shanklin paper basically obfuscated and concealed from the readers the most central facts of what Miller actually did, and in any case was so unsystematic and unbiased in its approach, excluding from the discussion of perhaps about 90% or more of Miller's extensive Mount Wilson data, as to render the conclusions meaningless. As a final note, after undertaking my research into the archives of both Miller and Shanklin at Case University and urging them and the faculty at the um, Case Western, whatever it was, Physics University department, uh, on the importance of the original Miller datasheet, they were finally located and placed into the archives. Nice. Conclusions. My review of this important but sad chapter in the history of science left me both astonished and frustrated. Miller's work on the ether drift was clearly undertaken with more precision, care, and diligence than any other researcher who looked upon the subject in question, including Michelson, Michelson, and yet his work was basically had been written out of the history of science. When Miller was alive, he responded concisely to his critics and demonstrated the ether drift phenomenon with increasing precision over the years. He constantly pointed out his critics he constantly pointed out to his critics the specific reasons why they were getting larger positive results, while others only got small results or no results. Michelson and a few others of the period Michelson and a few others of the period took Miller's work seriously, but Einstein and his followers appear to view Miller only as a threat, something to be explained away as expeditiously as possible. Einstein, in fact, was catapulted into the public eye following the end of World War II. Nuclear physics was then viewed as heroic, and Einstein fast became a cultural icon whose work could not be criticized. Into this situation came the Shanklin team with the apparent mission to nail down the lid on Miller's coffin. In this effort, they nearly succeeded. The Sh- the Shank the Shanklin conclusion against Miller was clearly negative, but one of the most systematic. Uh, yeah, but one systematic analysis of man but the one systematic analysis of his Mount Wilson data merely confirmed what Miller said all along, and that there was a clear systematic periodic effect in the interferometer data. The Shanklin paper also confirmed Miller's contention that the periodic effect was not due to random or mechanical effects. The Shanklin team subsequently searched for temperature artifacts in Miller's data, but they failed to undertake any systematic analysis and certainly important in his centrally important Mount Wilson data in this regard. Instead, they made a biased selection of a few published data sheets and unpublished data sheets obtained from different periods in Miller's research from different experimental locations, and including from his controlled experiments at Case School. Miller's Miller's most conclusive 1925 to 1926 Mount Wilson experiments encompass a total of 6,402 turns of the interferometer, recorded more than 300 individual data sheets. That the da- that was the data the Shanklin team should have focused on when they evaluated systematically. Instead, only a few of Miller's data sheets of these most centrally important experiments were selected, or Miller's man. Only a few of his good stuff was selected, and centrally important experiments were selected. Certainly, less than 10% of the data available to them was brought into the discussion, and only after being dissected to extract only those data that could easily be misconstrued as evidence for the presumed temperature anomalies. For certain, some of the data held for public critique came from Miller's controlled experiment at Case University, or possibly from the trial runs where where the technical bugs were being worked out in the apparatus and the building. Miller was no longer alive to inform us about his data, but when the Shanklin team willy nilly lumped together his published and unpublished work without comment, even though they were content to pick and choose the data they wished, they could not come up with a coherent and solid critique by which Miller's work would conclusively would be conclusively dismissed. Some of the data they selected merely confirmed Miller, though the Shanklin group seemed ignorant of that basic ether drift astronomy by which such interpretations could have been made. While alive, Miller openly stated that he addressed and corrected the thermal effects upon the apparatus, and yet the periodic elements of his measurements persisted. The Shanklin paper ignored Miller on this important point. The Shanklin group undertook no experiments of their own. Neither, dude, that's crazy. Neither on the question of the ether drift nor on the subject of thermal perturbations of a light beam and interferometry. They essentially made an armchair analysis of Miller's data. Only some of Miller's original data was carefully selected to make a rather unbelievable claim that some natural ambient temperature gradients in Miller's Mount Wilson observation hut might produce these fringe shifts in an insulated interferometer, similar to what Miller himself had previously observed in his controlled experiments using a strong radiant heater. The Shanklin paper argued that there must have been thermal effects at the Mount Wilson measurements, but provides no direct evidence for this. At no time did the Shanklin group present evidence that the temperature was a factor creating the periodic cosmological or the cosmic sidereal fringe readings observed by Miller in his data, even though this was stated in their conclusion. The fact that they presented evidence from Miller's own lab notebooks, which implied thermal gradients in Mount Wilson in the Mount Wilson interferometer house, would have been below the observational limit of the insulated apparatus. That's awesome. The larger issue of the periodic harmonic effects and the data expressed in the identical cosmic sidereal coordinate at different seasonal and all hours of the day was never addressed or evaluated by the Shanklin group. Neither was any attempt to be made to show exactly how any external temperature phenomenon could affect the interferometer reading to yield such a systemic effect of sidereal rotation. This issue was almost totally avoided by the Shanklin team after reading Miller's 1933 papers. The paper shows the Picanu in the I hope that I'm saying that right, and the biased nature of the Shanklin team procedure in the systematic sidereal periodicities observed by Miller expressed themselves nearly uniformly across the board throughout different magnitudes from 1906 to 1926. Miller undertook more than 200,000 separate readings in more than 12,000 turns of the interferometer, demonstrating harmonic periodic consistencies pointing to the same general axis of an ether drift in the cosmos, a factor of which was completely independent of the time and day of the season and year of the experiments were undertaken. At best, the critics provided only an ad hoc argument to claim or suggest without substance that some small part of Miller's data might contain an undefined temperature effect. It's hilarious. From all of the above, it appears that the Shanklin group, with some degree of consultation with Einstein, decided that Miller must be wrong They set out to see what they could cherry pick through his archive to support their a priori conclusion, which is not a scientific method. As I have discussed previously, Miller found that the ether drift to be stronger at higher altitudes and also to be the same with the experiment was undertaken oh man was undertaken. Where was it undertaken, guys? Experiment was undertaken in a heavy stone building with an interferometer light path that was encased by wood or metal shielding. In my studies over the last 40 years, I have found many examples from fields of biology, meteorology, and physics that independently support the assertion of a subtle energetic force with similar altitude dependent and metal reflective properties, notably in the works of Wilhelm Reich and Giorgio Picardi and Frank Brown. I'll have to check these out. So we got some citations here from DeMeo. Likewise, there are many new findings in astrophysics where the isotropy of the cosmological factors have been discovered, which are congruent with Miller's identified axis of the ether drift. Notably, notably, or I'm sorry, notable in the respect, notable in this. I mean, I'm just gonna keep saying notable forever now. Notable in this respect are the experiments of Cahill in 2006 and 2007 of chemistry, physics, and earth science department at Flinders University, Australia, working with the Belgian telecommunications company Bellicom in Brussels, Yuri Galev in 2002. Oh, we'll have to read about your boy Cahill. Let's see. So, yeah, Yuri Galev at the Institute of Radiophysics and Electronics Natural Science Academy of Ukraine, Manera in 2002 to 2009. Let's see, the Physics Department of the Universidad of Colombia in Bogota. Let's see. Let's see. And Lopez from a diverse institution, including the Physics Department of Bogota and the Max Planck Research Center in Hamburg, Germany. Sorry, this was just the list of all the names of the people that were involved in Monera's work. So I just didn't feel like reading all that. All of these newer studies have basically confirmed that Miller's results, including its general axis of the ether drift and sidereal day velocity components, down to the details expressed by Galev. To close, I asked the reader to imagine that the Michelson-Morley's 1887 experiment, which only ran 6 hours for 4 days, had resulted in a claim that the ether had been detected and that Dayton Miller had undertaken his years of work with 200,000 observations, including showing that the ether cannot be detected. It does not take much consideration to conclude that the fictional case Miller would today be would be cited in every physics book as having proved that the ether did not exist, and nobody would refer to Michelson-Morley. The fact that the present day situation is totally opposite of this fictional example, is a testament to the intensely political nature of modern science and how the major theories often develop into brief systems which demand an atomic suppression of any new finding which might undermine the faith of the popular wisdom in politically dominated groups of academics, and that the wisdom today is space is empty and immobile, and that the universe is dead. I submit that these are unproven and even disproven assertions, challenged in large measures by Dayton Miller, by Dayton Miller's exceptional work on the ether drift. I should now add to modern astrophysics today accepts without hesitation many theoretical concepts which basically fill the vacuum of cosmic space, and they appear either superficially or dramatically to similar types of Miller or to a similar Miller type of tangible, measurable cosmic ether in spite of their detection difficulties. Despite or examples of this are dark matter in a neutrino sea, the intergalactic or interstellar medium, or the cosmic plasmas. The the field of parapsychology could also find a potent explanatory mechanism in the cosmic medium for a transmission of sensory or impulses via as yet unclear excitation or mechanism more similar to old wave theory in modern particles based on consciousness based interpretational postulates. By Occam's razor, if not also by similarities of the properties, I postulate these are I postulate let's see. I postulate these are all one of the same thing as a well-known example of the 10 blind scientists in a room with an elephant, each grabbing a hold of what they are describing and describing what only to appear to be uniquely different parts of a unitary cosmic anatomy. All right. So that was it. Acknowledgements. My thanks to the Case Western Reserve University archivist and Bill. Yeah, so he's just thanking the people that did that stuff, courtesy of where we got the photographs. Cool, man. So all the citations for everything. Yeah. All right. Cool. All right. I'm out of here. Thank you guys for tuning in, and I'll catch you on the next one.